James Jeffrey, the former U.S. envoy to the Syrian file and the international coalition against ISIS, said in an interview with Asharq Al-Awsat that America is currently in a stronger position to negotiate with Russia on Syria, for many reasons, including that all pressure tools are still in the hands of President Joe's administration. Biden, and that Russia is mired in the Syrian quagmire. But Jeffrey urged the Biden administration to coordinate with its Arab and regional allies and the United Nations during the dialogue with the Russian side, to ensure its success in achieving its declared goals. Not doing so, Jeffrey warned, means either the Biden administration thinks Syria is unimportant, or they want to do something that no one wants to know. He pointed out that there are questions about whether there are people, in the U.S. administration, who are seeking another policy to hand over Syria, to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad or Russia. He explained that he was informed by high-ranking officials from the region that not only were they not encouraged, from the administration, not to normalize with Assad, but that they might have encouraged normalization, adding, "I think that the administration's position is not clear in this regard." Jeffrey revealed that he went with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and spoke to President Vladimir Putin in Moscow in 2019, and offered a deal that included a Russian-American swap over Syria, but Putin did not accept the plan because he thought we were at the end of the Trump administration who wanted to withdraw our forces. So Putin thought that there was no need to negotiate with us, and he would get Syria on a silver platter. Here is the transcript of the conversation Jeffrey had on the phone yesterday. About a year after taking over the administration of Joe Biden, how do you see his Syrian policy? It includes three elements. The first is, with few exceptions, such as the cancellation of the Delta Crest energy contract, the U.S. to invest oil in northeastern Syria, a continuation of the policy elements established by the administrations of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. The second is that there isn't as much progress or effort as high-level negotiations or clarifications from senior officials, from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, to say what the policy and priorities are in Syria. The third element, although the main goals in Syria are still the same, such as the International Resolution 2254, is the defeat of ISIS, the return of refugees and accountability, maintaining the ceasefire, and expelling the Iranians, a policy that lacks attention and focus, which raises questions about whether there are people, in the administration, they are seeking another policy to hand over Syria, to Syrian President Bashar Assad or Russia. I don't suppose that, but many ask these questions, because there is no clarity in American policy. We know the addresses, but we don't know the politics. So, in my foreign policy article, I proposed a plan to implement what the administration says is our public policy. Do you mean that there is a gap between saying and doing? No one knows. I spoke to everyone and noticed that no senior official in Congress or our allies in the Arab world or the Europeans, the United Nations, the Turks, the Israelis, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, do not know what our real policy is. Have the tools changed after Trump's departure? And does the Biden administration want to use it? All the tools are there, our forces on the ground, support, for bombing from Israel, Turkey in Idlib, the Syrian Democratic Forces, support for the United Nations, humanitarian aid, the fight against ISIS, sanctions, isolation, reconstruction and investment. We have all the tools. During the time of the Trump and Obama administrations, we tried, and we clearly told the Russians, the Iranians, and the Assad regime that these tools will remain in place, and Syria will not be normal under Assad's rule unless our concerns and those of our Arab, European, Turkish, Israeli, SDF, and Syrian allies are addressed. This means that each side will not get everything it wants, but rather the solution is a settlement. That's what I suggested, and we tried to do it. The chance of that happening now is higher. The current administration has a greater chance of doing so, but it must abandon plans it may have. I emphasize saying, it might have, because I do not know if these plans exist to reach other solutions, to strengthen Russia, Iran, and Assad. Are you indicating that the real US policy is to hand Syria over to Russia? No, never. The problem is that the administration does not talk to allies. Syria is a very important conflict, as is Ukraine and Taiwan, as a key decision point for how the United States and its allies should respond to global security matters. We have forces on the ground like our allies, and all of our allies want to know our plans clearly, especially since there is a suspicion that the administration does not believe that Syria is important, or that it wants to do something that it does not want anyone to know, because they think it should not be known. 3 goals. Blinken said that Washington has 3 goals in Syria: humanitarian aid, the fight against ISIS, and a comprehensive ceasefire. This means that they clearly stated their goals. I do not know if there is a strategy to achieve our goals. What about Iran? Do you mean that the Biden administration is still committed to removing Iran, as the Trump administration was seeking? I am convinced that the Biden administration wants to get Iran out. This is the position of the Trump administration. We knew that this was not realistic, but what we wanted to see was the end of strategic risks such as ballistic missiles, and this can be achieved through Russia and the Syrian government. They do not want these missile systems to defeat the Syrian opposition that is fighting with Kalashnikovs. Iran wants these missiles for its reasons, for its strategic positioning. I think the current administration is saying that is one of its goals as well, but it doesn't say whether it is capable or willing to develop a strategy to achieve that. This is not clear. Has Congress asked the administration to present a strategy for Syria? Yes, there is pressure, because in 2001 Congress authorized the administration to use force and deploy forces, so it wants to know what we're doing and what our policy is in Syria. Also, the Trump administration presented in March 2019 a secret vision of our policy, but it falls within the lines that I talked about, such as, our goal is not to remove Assad, which is certainly not the goal of the Biden administration, but rather its goal is to solve many problems, such as the ceasefire and the peace process under Resolution 2254, the return of refugees, the removal of Iran and its strategic missiles, the security of Turkey, the reintegration of Syrians who opposed Assad, and accountability. In theory, this is the current administration's policy. But they don't take it seriously enough to make efforts to achieve it, or they might try to do something different. We do not know. The lack of implementation of this agenda is confusing. What do you mean? What is happening in Syria is not only a terrible internal conflict. The fate of the Syrian people requires the intervention of the outside world and the United Nations to reach a solution. There are also other important factors, such as the weaponization of Syrian refugees in Turkey, Jordan, and Europe, the rise of ISIS, which the regime deliberately supported, the Iranian missile system, the security of northern Israel's borders, and the use of chemical weapons. These are all very important matters that must be resolved. The failure of any U.S. administration to attempt to resolve it is irresponsible. What do you propose to achieve? I propose a trade-off, matters related to sanctions, diplomatic recognition, reconstruction, investment, and dealing with the regime, in return for Assad and his allies taking steps within the agenda mentioned, such as refugees, the presence of Iran, the security of Israel, and the security of Turkey. That is, adopting a step-for-step approach. We presented a plan in the time of the Trump administration and shared it with our allies, and anything that needs to be done has to be along those lines. The step-for-step approach. Exactly, but there are things that concern me. It is not possible to do this with the Russians and reduce the pressure on Assad without transparency with all our allies, i.e. the United Nations, the European Union, European countries, the Arab League, Arab countries, the opposition, Turkey, Israel, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, because they all want to know the truth and be part of its implementation. The Russians do not want the Israeli bombing, nor the American forces, nor the sanctions and isolation, and they want the return of Arab relations. These are all matters that require decisions that are not purely American, but belong to our allies. Therefore, we cannot negotiate matters related to other countries without consulting with them. However, all the parties I spoke with do not see that this is happening now. Negotiating with Moscow or with Damascus and Tehran. We should not talk to the Iranians. The Iranians don't want to talk to us. The same goes for talking with Assad. All the parties that spoke to Assad, from Russia to the United Nations, the Arabs, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, got nothing tangible from him, whatever it was. Russia is the strongest party since Russia's intervention in 2015, and it was Russia that protected the regime in the Security Council as well as it protected it militarily. Russia has strong leaves. Russia is able. Do you think that Moscow is leaders in influencing Damascus? It's not easy. I know that. But the Russians will exercise their influence. If they knew that they would get something in return, they would not have if they had refrained from such influence. You were with Secretary of State Michael Pompeo when he spoke to President Vladimir Putin in 2019? Completely. I went with Secretary Pompeo and we spoke to President Vladimir Putin in 2019. I think he didn't accept the plan because he thought we were at the end of the Trump administration who wanted our troops out. So Putin thought that there was no need to negotiate with us, and he would get Syria on a silver platter. I understand that Putin did not want to make a deal with us at the time. Now, the situation is different. Our forces are in Syria. It is unlikely that the Biden administration will withdraw our forces after our withdrawal from Afghanistan. We will stay in Syria during Biden's term at least. But the Russians would not think of negotiating with us like that. We must act with our allies to get the Russians to act. What were the details of your plan in 2019? I mentioned our list of demands, our tools, and what can be done with our allies, such as Turkey, the Arab countries and the Europeans. We have sanctions, the refusal of diplomatic recognition, the Israeli bombing, and the refusal of reconstruction and investment in Syria. As I mentioned, what we want in Syria is the exit of Iran and its strategic missile system, a confrontation with ISIS, a settlement with the Syrian opposition so that people return to their homes, a solution to the problem in northeastern Syria, Turkey's security, clarity about the chemical weapons file, and assurances that there are no weapons left chemical. This is the basket to exchange one item for another. This is a diplomatic and tactical effort. During an American, European, Arab meeting in Brussels at the beginning of the month, there was a complaint that Washington does not share information with its allies, and is satisfied with reaching an understanding with Russia. I know our allies are upset because we don't talk to them. What is the position of the Biden administration on Arab normalization with Damascus? Arab countries, such as Jordan, are cautious about what they do. The Jordanians presented a plan and King Abdullah shared it with us and with President Putin. But this plan did not progress because Assad did not give any party anything. I think that this will limit Arab contact with Damascus, because it will not change things on the ground. I do not think that Syria will return to the Arab League next year, and the investments will not come because Assad refuses to cooperate. Arab normalization. Do you think that the Biden administration obstructed or encouraged normalization? The administration publicly asked the Emiratis not to meet Assad. But I was informed by high-ranking officials from the region that not only were they not encouraged by the administration, but that they may have been encouraged to normalize. I think that the position of the administration is not clear in this regard. So, you think the only way is to talk with the Russians to make a deal? Yes. But this will not work if the Americans do not do this in consultation with 6 or 7 major countries of our allies, not because they have a major role in Syria, but because they are also putting pressure on Syria, and will not stop without consulting with it, Turkey, Arab countries, Israel, and the Europeans, the opposition. All of these parties have a role. Does this require an American role? Perhaps they, the US administration, talk to the Russians from time to time, but we do not know what is going on between them. Most importantly, our main allies do not know. This means no success. Israel will not stop what it is doing, Turkey will not withdraw from Syria, and the Arab countries will not return Syria to the Arab League, unless it meets its demands. We do not have control over the decisions of these parties, so everything we talk about with the Russians cannot be implemented without our allies. Does this require a leadership role? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. I have hope for 3 reasons. First, that all the pressures and elements that we are doing are still there despite some of the normalization steps. And all the troubling pressures of Russia and Assad remain. The country is in disaster, and there is a ceasefire. There are 3 hostile armies, for Assad, in his territory, America, Turkey, and Israel. The tools are still there if management wants to use them. Second, it makes sense to do so because there are risks of major conflict. The third reason is that the current situation is better than the situation in the time of the Trump administration. The Biden administration is stable, and he does not want to withdraw our forces from Syria. In addition, the region is more united than in previous years. Look at the Arab, Gulf and Turkish relations. There are much better reconciliations and relations. There are many reasons to say that the region is united and calmer than in previous years. These are all encouraging and powerful elements for diplomatic initiatives. You mean that America is in a better negotiating position? Completely. The Biden administration will not sacrifice the tools we have. Yes, we are in a better diplomatic position. So, you want to plunge Russia into the Syrian quagmire? Russia in the quagmire of Syria. We succeeded. Really? How? Russia controls the air to support the regime forces and fight ISIS. The Syrian economy is in a catastrophe. The Russians tried to bring the refugees back, but no one came back. Assad did not gain additional territory, but rather control it through other countries. Also, the Israeli planes are in control of the air. Unless this is a swamp, then what is the definition of a swamp? The choice, then, either deal or quagmire. America in a better negotiating position? Yes. This is what I think. James Jeffrey, the former U.S. envoy to the Syrian file and the International